Well, it's a great pleasure, Geoffrey, and I have to shout because my voice has to go into that microphone. It's a great pleasure to be talking to an old friend and colleague. Many years, I've known since 1971 when I came to Cambridge, so that's 34 years. So Geoffrey Lloyd. And Geoffrey, when were you born?
1933.
Okay, one date so far, right. Okay, and tell me something about your parentage and your
Yes.
background.
Well, my father was a doctor. He was born in Swansea. My mother was born in Swansea too. He was Welsh. He was very Welsh. He learnt English as a foreign language at school, and the stories of his parents being rather persecuted, as people were when they were Welsh speakers in those days, were part of the family mythology. Came to London to make his reputation as a doctor. He was a TB specialist, a chest specialist, and he was quite a successful doctor. He had a surgery in Harley Street. He was pretty clueless socially, and that's where my mother came in, because she was really rather a beauty. And full of dynamism, quite unreliable in many ways, both socially and personally. But she used to help him because he didn't know, he didn't know how to eat peas or anything really. But he was part of a group of rather successful Welsh doctors who came up, like Dan Davis, for example, who came up to London. He wasn't successful as them, but he had a successful private practice, and if the war hadn't come, he would have been retiring around 1940, having made quite a lot of money. Now, shall I go on to the war?
Yeah.
Well, I was born in 33. The war broke out in 39, and then we were evacuated, my brother and I. My brother's just written his autobiography, a copy of which is in the college library, called While Memory Serves. He's got a rather good memory, I must say. But he had a very different life from mine in terms of his personality. I can perhaps mention a few things about him in King's, because he came to King's before me. But we were evacuated, that's to say my mother, my elder brother and I went from one place to another, 1939, 1940, 1941, 1942. I went to about 6 different schools before the age of 12. I went to nursery schools of different kinds. But we were evacuated to Staines, to Ashford, and then we went to Wales. And it was a very migratory kind of time. And we were separated from my father, who stayed in London. His job was to oversee a particular hospital that was set up for bomb-damaged patients. But he didn't serve in the army or anything like that. But he had to stay put in London, while the rest of us moved around. Wales, I hadn't lived in before that period. I'd been born in London, brought up in London, but I became pretty Welsh, although I never learnt Welsh, much to my father's disappointment. But we were in Wales during the war, and I had an absolutely appalling education. All these different schools the masters were the kind of people that weren't called up for decent service in the war. And they were often people who were injured or suffered from one disease or other, and they weren't impressive people, and they weren't impressive teachers. I went to a preparatory school. I suppose that would have been at about the age of 13. And it's the same preparatory school, I'll mention this, as Edmund Leach went to.
Really?
Yes. My father was going to send me to a public school. He'd never been to a public school. He went to a grammar school and he went to a medical school. But the ambition was to send his 2 sons to a public school, turn them into good would-be upper middle class English men. It wasn't very successful. But I was targeted to go to Charterhouse. I can talk about that in a minute. But went to this preparatory school called Lambrook, which was really a school full of rather rich children, but where the teaching was really pretty appalling. And one of the family stories about my early days at Lambrook, when my father and mother came to visit me, because it was a boarding school, we had to look after ourselves quite a bit, that the first time they visited me, because we'd been, all the pupils in the school were pretty fed up with everything, about the food, well that wasn't their fault, but also about the teaching. And I came rushing down the stairs to meet my father and mother, full of beans, saying, "There's a revolution on." Because we tried to protest against to the headmaster. Of course, there wasn't a revolution, but I found that very stimulating. That there was a possibility of protest against one's conditions. Then I went to Charterhouse duly, where I got a scholarship to Charterhouse. My brother was unfortunately head boy. So I was immediately targeted as being bumptious, arrogant. I wasn't either particularly bumptious or particularly arrogant, but it was easy to persuade other people that I was bumptious and arrogant, and then had to be sat on from a great height. But he left mercifully. He came to King's, and then from then on, I could be a bit more independent. Now, Charterhouse was the subject of novels by Simon Raven, famous novels, and by Freddie Raphael. And I don't recognize Charterhouse. The Charterhouse I knew neither corresponds to the Simon Ravens. Simon Raven was thrown out of Charterhouse, I think, for trying to seduce the headmaster's wife or something like that, something in that area. And he was a pretty debauched character, was Simon. I didn't have any experience of that. Freddie Raphael describes the school as ultra anti-Semitic. And again, I didn't encounter anti-Semitism. I was a contemporary of Freddie's at Charterhouse, but Freddie must have circulated in a completely different set. Now, there were two saving graces. Charterhouse was a pretty Philistine school. It was anti-intellectual. You weren't really allowed to develop your own intellectual interests. But I was a sort of covert intellectual. But I got away with it because I was terribly good at sport. I was in the cricket team, I was in the soccer team, I was captain of hockey. So they couldn't really bully me for being a swot. In the way that they would have done if I hadn't been a really very good cricketer. I could say that the cricketing team that the first 11, the captain was Peter May's younger brother. Peter May I just knew, he left earlier, but Peter May is a very famous cricketer who became chairman of the selectors. Not a very clever person, but a pretty good cricketer. So the cricketing side of me was a great defence. Now the other saving grace at Charterhouse was one teacher. There was only one teacher who was any good at educating. He was a hopeless teacher. He was my French teacher. His name was Harry Ardale, and he was a communist, and considered to be very persona non grata by the school establishment. He didn't teach French at all well, but he was marvellous as just a person to talk to. There were a group of us that used to go along, and he used to give us tea, and we used to listen to his records. It was a marvellous old-fashioned record player where a concert, a concerto would be 4 or 5 records, and you'd wait for the machine to turn the discs over. And he was, I can remember asking him, well, what about this chap Baudelaire? Why don't you ever talk about Baudelaire? And Baudelaire, he said, oh no, Baudelaire's terribly, Baudelaire's not on the curriculum. You're not allowed to talk about Baudelaire. So I discovered that there were people like Baudelaire who weren't on the curriculum, and of course I immediately went for them. And he thought that was fine, and he gave me a lot of help in terms of the kinds of things to read. And at that stage I was very interested in poetry, and there was a poetry group. Harry Ardale was not the sponsor of the poetry group, but he helped us. And Dylan Thomas, for example, we were reading W.H. Auden, and that sense of new poetry being published was exciting. Now I did, up until the age of about 16, I did the usual mix of everything. And at 16, I was far and away better at mathematics than at any other subject. And then I had very bad advice given to me. This is the first of several occasions in my life where the advice that was given to me was appalling. And this advice, unfortunately, I followed. I wasn't really in a position to say no, but other advice I did turn down. But the advice was, oh, you can always do maths on your own, but you better stay with classics, because classics is more demanding, I was told. And in fact, most of my friends were in the classics set, so we stayed with classics, which was an appallingly conservative thing for me to have done, really. And I did classics until I got into university. I tried for Oxford at the age of about 17, a bit young, where I was interviewed by Trevor Roper, who gave me absolutely no opening at all for anything. I remember that, but he turned me down. Oxford was, I wasn't good enough for Oxford. But in about 3 months, I took the examination for Cambridge, where Patrick Wilkinson was very keen to recruit people from Charterhouse. He realised that although the teaching in Charterhouse wasn't much good, nevertheless there were a lot of bright people. And I won a scholarship to Cambridge. And as soon as I won a scholarship in classics, I gave up classics at Charterhouse and spent my last year in the history 6th and taking private lessons from Wilf Noyce, who had been at King's. I was told about Wilf, and who'd come to Charterhouse after his great climbing of Mount Everest, and he was there, and I learnt Italian from him. And he was very helpful and exciting because we talked about poetry and we talked about Dante and so on. And so that was liberating. And the history teaching was not particularly great, but I did do about half a year as a specialist in history. Then I came to King's, and my brother had been at King's. He'd gone down. He'd been a medical student. And some of his old friends, he gave me, some of them were still around, so I met some of them. And really there were 3 groups of people in King's that King's was almost sort of 3 different colleges from some points of view. But one group was the people that my brother had hung out with. Actually, his greatest friends were people who'd come out of the war, who'd come back from service in the Second World War, and were really quite old, quite senior. But I'm not talking about them so much, because most of them had gone down, but people like Simon Raven, and some of Simon's friends, Martin Shuttleworth, Alan Cager-Smith. Later on, there were people like Mark Boxer. They were people who were pretty unconcerned about examination results, for example, and pretty dissolute. There was a second group, the scholars. We used to live in the drains, now torn down. In fact, many of the places I've lived in Cambridge have been torn down. Whether that's anything to do with my being there, it obviously isn't. But in the drains, there were a group of pretty solemn, serious-minded students, although what was fashionable among them, I haven't kept up with them at all, but what was fashionable among them was a sort of right-wing Catholicism. This is in King's. And if they read literature, it would be things like Brideshead Revisited that they were keen on. I spent quite a lot of time with them, inevitably in my first year, but eventually they dropped out. And then there was the third group of my own contemporaries, and in the people who were in King's who were most important for me among the undergraduates and the graduate students were people like Neil Acheson and Robert Erskine and Chris Foster. I don't know quite when I became an apostle, but I became an apostle. And the apostles were quite a liberating experience. They, of course, they were non-kings as well, people like Jonathan Miller, Carl Miller, and who else outside the college? I can't remember exactly. Certainly Moses Finley eventually became an apostle, and Noel Annan wasn't an apostle when he was an undergraduate or a graduate student. He was invited to become an apostle quite late in life. He felt always a little bit ashamed of that, for no good reason. But the apostles and the undergraduates around them, Eric Hobsbawm was an apostle, were really my closest friends and the people with whom I got most from, and certainly they were the great intellectual stimulus. Coming to King's was an absolute liberation, because, as I said, my public school had been Philistine and anti-intellectual, and at King's I could read what I liked, and I could study what I liked, and hang out with people and talk about, we weren't talking much politics, but we were certainly talking about art and literature and literary criticism and so on. Now I have to say really that I didn't want to read classics here either. And so I thought, before I came up, Wilf Noyce, who'd been teaching me Italian, said, "Oh, well, go and see Professor Vincent and see if he'll admit you to read modern languages." I went round to Professor Vincent. I think probably I seemed pretty pushy and pretty brash to him. At any rate, he said, "No, there's absolutely no way in which I'm going to accept you without a written letter from your director of studies." And I didn't even have a director of studies. And I had talked to Patrick Wilkinson about whether classics was the thing for me. And Patrick said, "Well, it probably is. It's probably more interesting than Italian, but, go and see the Italian specialists if you like." But the Italian specialists were so unforthcoming that I turned tail and fled and came back into classics. Now, the classics teaching was very, very good. Patrick Wilkinson, Donald Lucas, and the person who really encouraged me to stay in classics, and this is, I suppose, an important turning point in my career, was John Raven. John Raven had come from Trinity. He was dean of the college. At that stage he was unmarried. He was writing Kirk and Raven with Geoffrey Kirk, the pre-Socratic philosophers. And I didn't realize, I thought that John Raven must have been in King's for years and years and years and years and years, and his lectures on the pre-Socratic philosophers were absolutely enchanting. I assumed that they'd been going for years and years and years, but in fact I think it was fairly early on in the period in which he gave lectures on people like Thales and Anaximander and Anaximenes, and they were very exciting. John was absolutely superb lecturer.
Can you just spell those names out of the people he lectured on?
Lectured on?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, these are the early Greek philosophers. Thales, that's Thales, Anaximander, Anaximander, and Anaximenes, Anaximenes, and so on and so on. But it was very exciting. So I did part one. I wasn't working very much. Patrick Wilkinson from time to time said, "Are you working hard enough, Geoffrey?" But I worked hard enough to score pretty good marks in both prelims and part one. And so I was sort of scheduled to go on to do part two. And I stayed with classics to do ancient philosophy. And that was because of John Raven. At the same time, in those days, you were encouraged. I was encouraged by Patrick Wilkinson to have a quite broad educational experience in Cambridge, not just a question of hanging out with the apostles, but I went to Lewis's lectures, and I went to John Wisdom's lectures. I'd missed Wittgenstein because he was dead before the year I arrived in Cambridge, which was 1951. But I was taking lectures in philosophy and in English literature, literary criticism, and sampling that, and spending more time really doing other things than actually doing mainstream classics. The course was in those days challenging from a linguistic point of view, but not at all challenging intellectually, with the possible exception of ancient Greek philosophy. So one could sort of sail through it. I mean, it was silly to not to make the most of what Cambridge had on offer in other respects. But I'd been trained quite well in Latin and Greek at Charterhouse. I mean, one was put through one's paces. It was appalling to undergo all of the drill that one had to undergo in terms of grammar and syntax. But it was quite useful because it meant that one didn't have to do too much work to get a first in part one. But I was reading just about everything. I remember that Patrick used to encourage me to read novels, and at that stage I suppose I'd read most of the major French novelists, Russian novelists, French in French, but Russian not in Russian, but in English, Italian, and so on, and reading poetry, plays. I was a member of the Play Reading Society. There was a play reading society called the 10 Club. Dady Rylands used to appear from time to time. Philip Radcliffe was there. I think I was even secretary of the 10 Club. You had to organise play reading. You had to get sufficient copies of a particular play. It would be either a classic kind of play or a new play. And we met on, I think it was a Wednesday evening, and that was every Wednesday evening during term. Every Monday evening I was reading Greek plays, courtesy of the fact that Frank Adcock, the person who edited the first Cambridge Ancient History, we used to have rooms just above us in the great semicircular window that looks on the front court here. He organised Greek play reading, and he used to insist that the classical scholars turned up and read plays. We read plays, and we read an awful lot of plays, but we never discussed them because Frank Adcock wasn't interested really in discussing. I think he was maybe more interested in the sort of, how shall I say, the social life of getting all these, the new scholars, and thinking about who were the people that he could invite to play golf with him at Gog and Magog. But that was by the by. But I was spending quite a lot of time reading plays in one way and another. Now, where have we got to in terms of staying with classics even in part two? And by then I was really seriously wondering about what on earth I would do with my life. And my father was a doctor, my brother was a doctor, and I seriously considered whether I shouldn't start training as a medical student. But I was deterred by the fact that it was really a very long haul. And I suppose a major factor in my decision not to do that, well, there were two things really. One, I'd done rather well in part two, and I was given money if I wanted it, to do research. And secondly, I was already absolutely passionately in love with the person that I married, G. And so, the idea of...
Spell her name.
J.I. Her name is Janet. She was Lloyd before she married me. That's one of the reasons why we met. We both went to Pevsner's art lectures. And her name was Janet Lloyd, and she came up to me. The corny thing about this was it was February the 14th, Valentine's Day, and that year was 1953. She was a first-year undergraduate, I was a second-year undergraduate. And she said, "Is your name Lloyd? I've heard there's another person called Lloyd." So I said, "Yes, my name is Lloyd. What's your name?" And she said, "My name is Janet Lloyd." In fact, she was called Janet Lloyd, but she called herself J.I. because she was based in France. I can talk a bit about her, but she was a major factor in my decision, after all, to not to do 6 years of medical student training at that stage. And so I decided I would give research a whirl. Now that was research. It was very, very different from anything that would count as a proper PhD course now. I got 2 studentships in quick succession, both of which dictated that I should live in classical lands, not for the entire year, but one was the Craven, one was, I forget what the name of the other one was, but it meant for 3 months of the year I was in either Greece or Sicily or Italy. And I was supposed to be working on ancient philosophy, and it's not appropriate for an ancient philosopher to spend a lot of time in Greece. The studentships were really designed for an archaeologist rather than for an ancient philosopher. But I had a whale of a time in Greece. I met a lot of very interesting people. Athens I'd first been to Athens as an undergraduate in 1952 or 53. When I went back as a graduate student and spent quite a lot of time there, that was 1954, 1955, it was very lively. I met poets, musicians, people working in areas. There was people working in the World Council of Churches was quite an umbrella organization, and one of my close friends who now lives in California worked for the World Council of Churches, Sarah Rock. And she introduced me to a lot of musicians, including a chap called Simon Carras, who was preserving and reviving Byzantine music. But there were also popular musicians as well. And I bought a bouzouki. I learnt the bouzouki. I'd previously learnt the guitar. My brother was also a guitar player, but that was the Spanish guitar. But in Greece, I hung out in the bars playing the bouzouki with the people who taught me the bouzouki. And I did, I must say, very little work indeed. And I'd been told to, well, at least the advice that I was given was that I should study the development of abstract terminology in Greek philosophy. Abstract terminology consists, well, one focus of interest is what are called cis nouns, nouns ending in sigma, iota, sigma. And these are the abstract nouns that turn an adjective into a noun. And so I was supposed to collect all the examples of cis nouns and to do a study of them. This was advice that I was given by T.B.L. Webster. I'd gone to the professor, Guthrie, to ask for his advice, and he didn't know what to say, really. He did introduce me, however, to some Greek medicine and said the Hippocratic corpus is interesting, and I thanked him for that. But he said, well, why don't you go and consult Professor Webster, T.B.L. Webster at University College London, and see what he has to say. And Webster, who was the kind of person that would himself enjoy doing a philologically oriented study of Greek philosophy, suggested cis nouns for you, Lloyd. Off you go to do cis nouns. And so I made a card index of cis nouns in the moments when I was not playing the bouzouki and was getting absolutely nowhere. Absolutely nowhere. I was having a marvelous time traveling around Greece. Athens was, as I say, very vibrant. But as for research, it was really pretty much a dead duck. But I'd been reading quite widely. What I can't remember exactly is when I first met Maya Fortes, because what put me on to what I eventually did my PhD on, which was polarity and analogy, it was called analogy and polarity originally, I think it was a combination of reading in anthropology and talking to Fortes. Certainly in my PhD there's acknowledgement of Fortes's advice. We're talking I graduated in 54. Moses Finlay arrived in Cambridge about 53 or 54, I think, and I didn't know him all that well. Of course, I was an undergraduate. Edmund Leach arrived in approximately 1953, I think, but again, of course, I didn't get to know.
And Meyer was in 49, he was elected as.
49. Well, now.
But he probably didn't come to King's straight away.
No, but at any rate, I certainly consulted him about anthropological reading. And I decided, I wasn't given any advice about how to use my analysis of cis nouns, and in fact I completely abandoned the cis nouns project. And I was, well, I don't quite know how I chose to study two modes of argumentation in early Greek thought, but I think it was on the back of, after being influenced by what I'd read it was Durkheim. It was Durkheim and Lévi-Breuil that suggested to me that there was something to be done. And I wrote the first draft of that thesis, having done almost no work at all for 2 years, 54, 55, 55, 56. I wrote the first draft of that thesis in about 3 months or 4 months, and bunged it in for the research fellowship competition here. And here being King's College, Cambridge. Now, I got to research fellowship. I had to put it in I suppose it must have been December of 1956. And I was told that I'd been given a research fellowship, which was to start, I think, in March 1957. By then, I'd married G, and we were living in London, and she was earning the family bread. I mean, I still had a studentship, but we didn't have any money. She was working as a translator in Shell at that stage. We were living in London. I didn't have to spend much time in Cambridge itself because I'd already done all my terms as an undergraduate pretty well. And what I was told about why I was successful in the fellowship competition, which is always a bit of a lottery, was not because John Raven, who was a fellowship elector, was pushing me, though I'm sure he was supporting me. Two people thought that what I'd written was suggestive, interesting, certainly unpolished. One was Braithwaite, Richard Braithwaite, the moral philosopher, and the other was Arthur Hibbert, a medieval historian. And they certainly did talk to me and say, well, what are you going to do with this work now that you've opened up a new subject, which was modes of reasoning, polarity and analogy, where the polarity was certainly quite heavily indebted to the anthropological work. Analogy I'd been interested in for a long time in various contexts, the use of metaphor, and this relates to the other interest of mine in poetry, actually. But both Arthur Hibbert and Richard Braithwaite were very supportive. Okay, well, I was lucky enough to win a research fellowship in 1957, and we bought a little house in Cambridge, but I still had my national service to do. Most of my friends from Charterhouse had gone into their national service, did their national service immediately after leaving school, and in fact, 3 of them. One died in Korea, one died training as a pilot, but not in Korea, and one died, I forget the other circumstances, but 3 of my classmates were dead within 3 years of leaving Charterhouse, doing their national service in one way or other. I mean, I wasn't to know that, but I decided I didn't want to do my national service. In fact, I seriously considered pleading that I was a conscientious objector. And I got a lot of help from Neil Acheson, for example, about what happens to people who decided to plead that they were a conscientious objector. And my friends, it was not the moment to do national service in 1951 or 52 or 53. There was a whole sequence. There was the Korean War, and then Some of them got caught a second time. They were called up a second time and had to fight in Suez, and there was Mau Mau. It was simply not a good moment. And certainly, if I'd done my national service then, I don't know quite what I would have done, because I certainly wasn't prepared to fight in the Suez campaign. I preferred to go to prison. But I was thinking that I would be a conscience objector, but Acheson warned me that one would be questioned, naturally enough, about whether one would ever have fought against the Nazis. Now, at that point, of course, I would have fought against the Nazis if I'd been of an age. So I'm not really a proper conscientious objector, and I could see that I wouldn't really pass as a conscientious objector. So I delayed and delayed and delayed doing my national service as long as I possibly could. But eventually they caught up with me in 1958. And when I was already a Fellow of Kings, I was already married, we already had a son, and it was not a good time to have to do one's national service. Shall I talk a bit about that? Well, the first year, I was recruited into the Northamptonshire Regiment. Being my home being in Cambridge, I was assumed to be a Cambridge boy, and I was therefore put into the Northamptonshire Regiment. This was pretty traumatic. I learnt even more than I'd done at Charterhouse about institutional torture, really, institutional humiliation. The first thing I had to do when I arrived at the barracks just outside Northampton was to clean the urinals of the caked urine in the bottom with a bayonet. I had no other cleaning tools but a bayonet. Well, that was, but you know, I'd already been to a public school, so I knew about bullying and humiliation, but that was a pretty humiliating experience. Now, I was trying to get out of the Northamptonshire Regiment, and I previously thought that I'd be quite clever and not do regular national service, but use the fact that I was fluent in modern Greek to try to do something to help in the Cyprus situation, where the AOCA was, of course, by then, in 1957, was conducting a war of independence against the Brits. And I'd tried to get into a position where I could use my modern Greek to good advantage to help in that situation. And I think it must have been Noel Annan who introduced me to Philip Noel Baker, who was a member of Parliament and had also Greek connections. And he suggested that I might try to go and talk to the people in the Foreign Office about using Greek. But this was not what I wanted at all, because when I got there, I was interviewed. This was before I before I became a national serviceman and before I was drafted into the Northamptonshire Regiment. And they said, well, we're looking for interrogators. And they said, well, you're going to have lots of money. You know, we'll make it all very easy for you, and what we really need is people to interrogate the rebels. So I said, thank you very much. That is not what I want to do with my modern Greek. But I'd learnt about what they were doing in Cyprus, and I was pretty frightened. Then, when I got out of the Northamptonshire Regiment and became an officer in the Intelligence Corps. And in the Intelligence Corps, you were given a little questionnaire. Where do you want to do your Intelligence Corps service? And I, of course, married with a child, said, I want to stay in England. And all the other people who were being turned into officers with me, I was older than most of them, of course, they all said, oh, we want to go abroad, we want to go abroad. They all had to stay in England. And I was sent to Cyprus. And I thought, gosh, they've rumbled me. They think that they'll use me after all in some kind of capacity. as some kind of interrogator. I was in the intelligence corps. But they hadn't. I mean, the left hand didn't know what the right hand was doing. I had not owned up to speaking Greek. I'd owned up to speaking various other languages, including, I'd travelled around not only Italian, Spanish, French, but Serbo-Croat up to a certain point, even, German as well. But I hadn't owned up to Greek. But then when I was sent to Cyprus, I thought, wow, they've really cottoned on to the fact that I speak Greek. So I arrive in Famagusta harbour, and I get off the boat, and I have to go up to Lefkosia, to Nicosia, to check in, as it were, to register. And the person who drove the lorry, the 10-ton lorry or the 6-ton lorry or whatever it was, turned out to have been a Cypriot who'd been a patient of my father's. And of course I started talking to him in Greek. And I was yabbering away in Greek, and I was accompanied by various sort of people like sort of sergeants, British sergeants. And when they got to Nicosia, they reported to their commanding officer, this person is a wog, more or less. I don't know whether they actually used that expression. But the commanding officer, who was a bit of a twit, said, what are you doing? Why are you speaking Greek? And I said, well, I do speak Greek. And he said, we haven't ever had anybody speak Greek in the intelligence corps in Cyprus, which turned out to be correct. And my job in port and travel control, my job in Famagusta Harbour was just a routine job of checking boats. It's a sort of customs kind of job. I don't know whether we've got time, whether I'm overrunning on time, but I'll tell you the story of the one person who was on the blacklist, whom I did have to check out. Have we got time?
No.
Well, normally people who were wanted never went near anything like a port. I mean, they got in and out of the country clandestinely, of course. But there was one person who was on the list. He was only on the list. There was the blacklist of about 20 people. And the blacklist was drawn up in a pretty random way, with very little intelligence, of course. And he was on the list because he'd wanted to do a university career. There was no university in Cyprus. And he went to Poland. He went to Warsaw. He did his PhD in philosophy in Warsaw. Polish, must be a communist, must be dangerous, must be on the blacklist. So he comes in to Famagusta Harbour completely innocent of any sort of record that might have been put him on the blacklist. And so Lloyd was suddenly summoned, the only time I was ever sort of brought down to the harbour to use my modern Greek. And it's extraordinary. It's really pretty well unbelievable, because this guy had studied philosophy, studied ancient philosophy indeed, and was writing on Aristotle's categories. Now, I asked him what he was doing, and he said he was working on Aristotle. This was all in modern Greek, Aristotle's categories, and I said, well, that's interesting. And then we started talking in the way that one would talk about, the latest stuff that had been written on Aristotle's categories. Meanwhile, I was surrounded by the non-Greek speaking Brits, who were my sergeants and staff sergeants and corporals and goodness knows what. What's he saying? What's he saying? What's he saying? And they were very worried that the guy was bluffing. But I knew he wasn't bluffing, because the way in which he was talking about his work. And he became a very good friend. I mean, while he moved around Cyprus. Now, what was his name? I'm afraid I can't remember his name. He then became a professor of ancient philosophy in one of the universities attached to the University of Toronto. But we were quite good friends. When he left Cyprus, he had to go through Famagusta again. And he said, "Thank you very much, Geoffrey. You've been a great help." So that was my only, as it were, passage of in a potentially embarrassing moment. But we spent a year. Guy came out to join me with our eldest boy, and we spent a year there, during which I felt pretty isolated. I didn't really, we didn't really have any problems. I had good friends with both the Greeks and the Turks. I should have said that we arrived in 1959. It was 1959-60. The agreement had been signed. It was just a question of arranging for the handover. And at that stage, Greeks and Turks were on much better terms than they later became. You know, I'm devastated at what's happened to Cyprus since, because it seems to me to be inexcusable that they, well, the person who was responsible for that, who tried to take over, was Samson, who was on the blacklist, and he was a nasty bit of work, no doubt about that. But the way in which the Greeks and Turks have quarrelled with one another, and Greeks have quarrelled, is pretty devastating. And we had a period in Cyprus when it wasn't idyllic, but it was certainly perfectly amicable. And as I say, we had friends both among the Greeks and among the Turks. And I was left more or less to my own devices. Got back to Cambridge, and this is 1960, when I'd finished my national service, is really a pretty important year for me, because I came back to my fellowship, and I can remember a conversation I had with Edmund Leach. Edmund Leach went to America in 1961, so this must have been 1960, I think, or it might have been, I think it was 1960. And I hadn't really met him when I was a graduate student. And I remember a conversation with him in the chapel, of all things. We were admitting that the fellowship had gathered in the way that it does to admit a new fellow. And while we were waiting for the provost to come in, I sat next to Edmund, and I started talking about right and left. And he said, "Oh, that's a very, very interesting subject. Have you read Eltz? Have you read," by then Rodney Needham had translated and edited Eltz's essays, Death on the Right Hand. Have you read that? And had I met Rodney Needham, and so on and so on and so on. So although we had to keep our voices down because it was in the chapel after all, I was inspired by this conversation, and he introduced me to Rodney Needham. Must have been that year or the following year. I went over to Oxford, found him incredibly helpful and indeed inspiring. And that was a turning point. In my PhD, which I finished in 1958, there is an acknowledgement to Forties, but not the kind of anthropology that I eventually put into the 1966 book. Polarity and Analogy actually was finished in about 1963 or 64, but by then I had got the bit between my teeth in terms of using anthropology to help with the ancient Greeks, and Lévi-Strauss was all the rage. Anthropologie structurale came out in 1958?
Something like that, yes.
1958. Now, my much thumbed copy of that book, I looked at when I put the date in, and it was 1960 that I bought my copy of Lévi-Strauss, which was a little bit after it was published, but not that long after. And certainly I devoured that book, and devoured the studies that he refers to, Nimoy and Dajou, and goodness knows what else, the Eastern Timbira and so on. I mean, it was very interesting work, and very relevant, I thought, to the Greeks. So that was a moment when I became a much more serious reader of social anthropology. Maya Fortis had put me in that direction, but it was the meeting with Leach that really made me take it much more seriously. And so that book came out. It came out in 1966. But the other, I haven't mentioned Moses Finley yet. Yeah. Well, I didn't really know Moses very much before. Well, of course, went to his lectures, And when I was a graduate student, as I said, I was quite often in Greece rather than in Britain, but I got to know him quite well as soon as I got back in the 60s. And he was an inspiration. The World of Odysseus was certainly a book that showed a way of using sociological and anthropological analysis to throw light on texts, important texts. And he was a great person. And he not only helped me, but he also helped my wife, because he gave G her first translating job, which was translating French into English, French ancient history, Claude Mosse. But Moses himself was a very sparky individual, and Moses had been taken up in a big way by the French. And there's an article written by Vidal-Naquet about Moses, L'heure de Moses Finley, in Annales. And I think that, I looked that up, and I think that's 1965, but I think he'd been in touch with Moses before that. And this was a marvelous, critical, but really very complimentary analysis of what Moses had done up until 1965, when Moses was, after all, still had many years in front of him of important work in ancient history. Moses invited Vidal-Naquet and Vernon to Cambridge, and that must have been, I think, in either 65 or 66. And so I met both of them in Moses' house at a dinner party. Moses said, "Geoffrey, you must speak more slowly. They don't..." And I said, "But Moses, these people understand French and I'm speaking French." And Vernon was incredibly generous. Vernon and Vidal-Naquet, between the two of them, completely bowled me over. And although when the book was published, 1966, as I say, I'd finished it a bit before that, it doesn't have, to my undying shame, the references to Vernon and to Vidal-Naquet that it should have had. And that was pointed out by the French reviewers. A chap called Jacques Brunschvig reviewed that and said he hasn't really understood that the other side of La Manche, the things are happening in a similar way. But it's a very generous review, nevertheless. But I met them, and that was a further important turning point. So there's the turning point in 1960, meeting, well, really not meeting Leach, but being inspired by Leach. And then Moses Finley was an increasing presence and influence, and that was, as it were, crowned by introduction to the French in 65, 66. That led to my going to Paris to give lectures, where I also met people like Detienne, and I've been going to Paris off and on every so often, quite frequently, not so frequently in recent years, but quite frequently ever since. Now, 1966, the book came out. There'd been a major quarrel in the classics faculty over a university assistant lectureship that had been advertised in 1964 or maybe 63. And there were two camps. There was the camp that said this must go to a philologist, and there was a person who became a professor of Latin who was very, very much favoured. Philology was still very dominant in the classics faculty. And there was Finley, who said, no, we want to do something more imaginative. Why don't we have Lloyd? And the appointments committee was completely hung. You have to have a certain majority. And they didn't have a majority. And Moses, who was a crafty politician, said, oh, well, we must all resign, and they must have a completely clean slate, a new appointments committee. And the new appointments committee didn't have the old guard on it. It wasn't packed with people who backed Lloyd. But it meant that I got a university assistant lectureship in 1967. I'd better look at my notes again. '65. It was in '65, actually, before the book was out. But I remember circulating the typescript of the book to to various people. But so in 1965 I got a university section lectureship, which meant that I would probably be making my career in Cambridge. That hadn't been anything like a foregone conclusion, because my research fellowship, you had a research fellowship for 4 years in King's. It could be renewed for 2, and only very, very rarely was it renewed thereafter. Well, I'd intermitted while I did my national service, but my research fellowship was coming to an end. But courtesy of this rearguard action by Finlay to not to go for philology, but to go for my kind of weird ancient philosophy, I got a university assistant lectureship. And by then I was already, I think, an assistant tutor in King's. And so I was going to make my career in King's and in Cambridge. And I was combining, doing quite a bit of writing with being involved as assistant tutor in helping. It was John Broadbent who was the senior tutor. I was heavily involved in admissions. I was heavily involved in meeting and talking to and entertaining undergraduates. We lived in the house that we live in now, 2 Prospect Row, and my wife and I entertained undergraduates on a free-for-all basis every Sunday evening during full term. In those days, King's wasn't co-residential, so we used to have to persuade unsuspecting New Hall girls or Newnham girls to come and liven it up a bit. But we had really pretty exhausting parties that would last late into the night every Sunday evening during my period as an assistant tutor. But I enjoyed, I do enjoy the young, and I find that it's not at all, I don't feel at all unhappy at combining doing what is generally sort of thought of as admin along with research. 66, Polarity and Analogy came out to a very mixed response. I can talk about that, but it may not be relevant. Well, yes, but let me just finish the sentence. Then I became involved in rather more popular books. 68, I published a book on Aristotle, which was hard. I was hired by Cambridge University Press to do a companion volume to John Raven's Plato's Thought in the Making, and it's a very superficial book, I have to say now, but it still sells. It's still in print, and it still sells to people who want a sort of a very elementary introduction to Aristotle. And then Moses Finlay got me to do 2 books on Greek science. And that started me off on Greek science. But Polarity and Analogy, to go back to the reception of Polarity and Analogy, the reception in classics was one of, well, what's all this about? Reception in philosophy was, this is totally unphilosophical. Of course, Polarity and Analogy, of course you have to use arguments of one or other of these kinds. What's Lloyd's problem? So there was a chap called David Hamlin who reviewed Polarity and Analogy pretty savagely, actually. I forget where he did that, but he was discouraging philosophers from reading it. Rodney Needham thought the world of it. Rodney Needham reviewed it in American Anthropology, I think, saying that this was the kind of applied anthropology, applied to ancient history, that should be encouraged. And it was taken up by the French. Brunschvig, who later translated my books on Greek science.
How do you spell it?
Brunschwig, and he's the cousin of Vidal-Naquet. He's an ancient philosopher. He's simply the best ancient philosopher in France, and has been for some time. He's a marvelous person, much less outward going than Vidal, but an absolutely splendid ancient philosopher. And he gave the book a very warm welcome, despite the fact, as I've already said, he pointed out that I wasn't using the French enough, which was indeed the case. So I was successful in other circles, but certainly not in mainstream classics. And indeed, my use of anthropology both in my PhD and in the book was something that even my research supervisor was pretty skeptical about. My research, Geoffrey Kirk, the other half of Kirk and Raven. And Geoffrey Kirk was faced with the problem that I was in Greece and he was here in Cambridge. I only saw him, I think, as a graduate student maybe 3 times, maybe 4 times. And he was certainly very worried about the eccentricity of my using, from his point of view, my using anthropology. And he said, well, Geoffrey, you may not get away with this. You may get turned down. And that would be terribly bad for you and for me. Eventually, of course, it was rather amusing and ironic that when Geoffrey Kirk came to write his book on mythology, which was the Sather Lectures on mythology, he came to talk with me and he said, well, this chap Levi-Strauss that you were reading in those days, can you tell me a bit more about him? So I was in a position of giving him a bit of a supervision on Levi-Strauss, which was I enjoyed doing. By then, of course, he'd really devoured. He was very, very well read. But it's a weird book, his work on mythology, and it was not the kind of book that I would have read. But I was not really persona grata with the classicists, and they were a bit sceptical about what I'd done and what it would lead to.
We're on to King's about 1966, 67.
Yes. Well, and as I was saying that I got involved in the tutorial work, first of all as assistant tutor to John Broadbent, and then I was appointed to be senior tutor. Edmund was provost. I was sent to the States in 1968-69 because Edmund felt that I hadn't had enough experience outside Cambridge, which was correct. So I went on an investigation of the situation in different American campuses. I spent some time talking to the people who'd demonstrated at Columbia on Morningside Heights, and again in Berkeley. And I was finding out about student politics. It's very varied. Why the Americans demonstrated varied enormously from place to place. Sometimes it was a question of Vietnam. Sometimes it was a question of internal politics. Sometimes it was the social situation. So Columbia and Berkeley, to my mind, were arguing about rather different things from one another. At any rate, that was a period when there was a sit-in in Cambridge. Ken Polak was senior tutor between John Broadbent and me for a year, but it was the period of the sit-in. Now, and representation of students on faculty boards and on college councils. King's was in an interesting position because we'd had students on the college council for some years. They technically didn't have a vote, but that didn't mean to say that their voice was ignored. Quite the contrary, not having a vote, sometimes quite an advantage, because people feel that your point of view had better be taken into account. I can always remember Morgan Forster at the King's governing body. He didn't have a vote, but what he felt counted for about 7 or 8 votes, single-handed. Still, we'd had perfectly good experience of student representation, and it had worked very smoothly. There was a certain amount of aggravation. The economics faculty, as I recall, had decided that they wanted to have students on their faculty board, and they also wanted to, I think, abolish the form of the tripos examination. And the university decided that they shouldn't do that. So, but the way in which the argument went, it wasn't all dons versus all students, of course. There were quite a number of dons who were supporting the student cause, and quite a number of students who weren't particularly interested in stirring things up. It was a pretty unhappy time from many points of view in Cambridge, in that people were politicking and getting upset if their point of view was not accepted. I was really out of that because I was in America. I came back in '69 to be senior tutor, and the main thing that we were concerned with at that stage was to get through co-residence. Now, the argument about co-residence, to go co-residential, again, different points of view were expressed in order to suggest that we should go co-residential. That's to say, there was a sort of idealistic view that it was better quality education to have co-residence. But the overwhelmingly important argument for many people was simply that there was not enough places for women in Cambridge. So the three colleges that went co-residential, that's to say King's and Clare and Churchill, went co-residential largely in order to increase the proportion of women in Cambridge. Because there was one woman to every 6 or 7 men in the situation that in my undergraduate days in the 50s. We went co-residential, and that was a difficult time for the first generation of women, because they were normally pretty tough people to apply in those circumstances, but they didn't realize to what extent they'd been under the microscope here. And in the end of the first year, I think the number of them felt that the pressure on them had been much greater than they'd actually realized at the time. Nevertheless, it went on the whole quite smoothly. We had women dons, women tutors. Joanna Ryan was one. Tess Adkins came in later, and that was quite smooth. We'd had graduate students, and the whole thing seemed actually perfectly natural. There was in Cambridge, there were a number of colleges that said, they would never go co-residential, including Trinity. I remember the senior tutor of Trinity saying, "You don't think that Trinity is ever going to admit women undergraduates, do you? You've got another thing coming." But of course, in no time at all, a whole lot of colleges that had originally objected very strongly were co-residential, partly because it was obvious the case that to be a co-residential college was much more attractive to many applicants, and you get better quality of applicants, and the academic record was much better. And it was in their interest to go co-residential, although sometimes they'd expressed various very conservative views about not doing so. Now, that was something that was not particularly controversial in King's, and it, as I say, it went through fairly smoothly. Edmund was a controversial provost because he made a number of statements about teaching and administration in the Reith lectures, and when it actually came to running a college, there seemed to be a bit of a mismatch between what Edmund had said about how you're over the hill at age 50, was it? I can't remember, and what he was actually doing. And he was pretty autocratic. And on a number of occasions, I quarrelled with him on the college council and found him rather difficult, because Edmund was a person who didn't like to be outvoted at all. These were not I don't think we disagreed on fundamental policies, but on matters to do with particular appointments, let's say. Edmund didn't like not getting his way. And so I found him a difficult person. And when it came to being renewed as senior tutor, instead of being renewed after the first 3 years for a further 3, I said I'd only do another year, because I didn't think that I was getting on sufficiently well with Edmund. Although intellectually, I'd had so many marvellous conversations with Edmund in the past about matters of the mind, that we could draw on that even when the going was a bit rough. It was ridiculous that we quarrelled in the way that we did on the college council, because after all, you would have thought that we might have agreed from many points of view. But I was decided that I didn't want to continue with that, and I withdrew from the college tutorial side, although I had always enjoyed getting to know undergraduates and helping them insofar as one could help them. There were many very bright undergraduates. One of the undergraduates who I think I was the personal tutor of was Charles Clark, who became president of the Union, I first got to know Charles Clarke because he was a friend of an undergraduate who had a nervous breakdown. And Charles and I used to go and visit this chap in the Evelyn, and we used to go together. And so this was nothing to do with politics, it was to do with welfare. And he was a very considerate and imaginative person. Thereafter, when Charles was a controversial figure in Cambridge politics, although nothing like as controversial as he's become later, again, I got on fine with him at a personal level, and there was not the aggravation within the college during the period when I was tutor, where it wasn't as if there were groups of students who wanted to bash the college. There were arguments about keeping records of undergraduates, that kind of issue, but it wasn't as if there was great aggravation. In fact, it was King's was pretty consensual, really, in those days. It became much worse in Bernard Williams' provostship, where there was a number of undergraduates who really did target Bernard himself, and he got extremely unhappy at the way in which he couldn't persuade them. Bernard operated on the assumption of rational man, and you'd only got to produce a decent argument and people would see that it was a decent argument and agree with you. But there's some bloody-minded people in the world. Perhaps he hadn't met very many of them before, but they certainly were bloody-minded when in that period. So he was quite unhappy. But then I didn't have much further to do with college administration until I became involved in the research centre, which was something I enjoyed doing. The research centre had a number of very interesting, imaginative projects. I wasn't involved in the one that was involved in linguistics, but I was involved in the one where the mathematicians, chaos, pure and applied mathematicians got together, and I was involved in some of those policies, and I enjoyed doing that, although
you were the convener.
I was the convener, the so-called convener. But the next shift in my own development came when I started going to the Far East. Now, I was invited to Japan in 1981 by a person who translated one of my books, Kawada Shigeru.
K-O-W.
K-A-W-A-D-A Shigeru. He's an absolutely marvelous person. He'd never been outside Japan, but he met me and was such an imaginative and warm friend that we were completely bowled over. I've written about that in a Japanese journal called Pedilavium, about the Lloyds, because she was, of course, with me, and she was equally won over by this reception. Kawada was one of the two main pupils of a very remarkable Japanese philosopher called Tanaka, T-A-N-A-K-A, Michitaro,
Yes.
who was a pacifist. His books were banned and I think even burnt. He was anathematized by the Japanese during the war. He stayed in Japan, where his house was firebombed by the bombs, not by a firebomber, by in the bombardment, and he had to have plastic surgery on his face. But he was Kawada's teacher, and Tanaka Michitaro had created a tradition of work in Western humanist scholarship, including Greek. A number of people who studied the Greek philosophers in Greek in his immediate circle. And the idea was, as a counterbalance to the nationalism in Japan at the time, a counterbalance to Shintoism as it had been appropriated by the Japanese nationalists. Kawada was one of his two great pupils. The other one was Fujisawa, who's recently died, and I met both of them. We travelled extensively. Kawada had a marvellous gift for understanding what Xi and I were bothered about when we would go to some shrine or other and we would think, my goodness, what on earth is going on here? There's the Fox Shrine in Kyoto, for example, and it really is a bit difficult to take if you don't expect it. And Kawada would say, well, no, let me explain that, there are the different villages want to be represented in Japan, want to be represented in this shrine. So they produce, it's rather competitive to have a particular shrine on this mountainside in Kyoto. But he was very good at explaining what was going on, and we met some very interesting people, and we had good friends. We met a Japanese social anthropologist by the name of Aoki, if I remember rightly. I later met Emily Onukitioni, but that was not in Japan. And their social anthropology is pretty remarkable. Kawada came to Cambridge. I invited him back here. And we were pretty worried because although his English is okay, he'd never been outside Japan. And we thought, my goodness, he's going to be feeling pretty isolated and disoriented. But actually, when he came here, he was the life and soul of the party, over and over again. He's a remarkable personality and a very, very great friend. And so we had contacts in Japan, and we've been to Japan, not more than about 4 or 5 times, I think, in total, once every sort of 5 or 10 years, something like that. But that was an important moment. And then the second, perhaps even more important moment, was when, in 1987, we were invited to go to Beijing to lecture at Beida and at the Academia Sinica, Academy of Sciences. And 1987 was a marvelous moment. It was very open. The Cultural Revolution had finished. People talked about that very openly, very honestly about that. We never found anybody who supported any of the policies that were implemented in the Cultural Revolution, then or since. And it was 2 years, of course, before Tiananmen. And my students were absolutely amazing. The students, it was quite exhausting. The lecture would begin, I think, at about sort of 1:30 or so. The lecture would go on until about 3:30 or maybe 4. That was the official part. Then the unofficial part would start from 4 till about 6, and then we would go out to have a meal, and they'd keep going the whole time. Now, I was lecturing about Greek mathematics and medicine and philosophy, and they, over and over again, really pointed to anomalies as they saw them, not only in Greek mathematics, but also in the Western tradition. And one of the things that would give you an illustration, the prime illustration of this, was Greek axiomatic deductive demonstration, as in Euclid. I can remember lecturing on Euclid's proof of the Pythagoras' theorem and of the infinity of primes, for example, and explaining how the axiomatic deductive style worked. And they said, why on earth? What is the point of these axioms? I mean, of course, you can talk about axioms in modern Chinese, but there isn't a term for axiom in classical Chinese, and they did without axiomatization at all. Their mathematics works differently. It's interest in algorithm, but it isn't as if there's no interest in proof. But the proof proceeds differently. The proof proceeds by verification. And the mathematics grows laterally by extrapolation rather than vertically by deduction, further results following from further application of the axioms. Now, they were so pressing about why axiomatization in Greece that when I got back to England in 1987, I said to myself, well, I really must learn sufficient classical Chinese to be able to study the mathematics and the medicine and the philosophy in the original. And I was fortunate enough, the person who'd invited me to Beida, I managed to get a grant for him to come to Cambridge for a year, which he spun out. He was here for a year and a half. Li Jun, his name is. And we used to read the Metaphysics of Aristotle one week, and then a classical Chinese text the next, and we did that for a year, and he would give me some elementary instruction in classical Chinese. But I was taught also by a graduate student who was at Darwin called Bridie Andrews, who took me through basic classical Chinese grammar, and she used me as a sort of guinea pig for her teaching, but she did it very tactfully and very patiently. I wasn't making very much progress while I was still sticking to the regular texts, Munktze, Mencius, and the Tao Te Ching. But when I suggested to Bridie Andrews that I'd like to read with her the medicine and the mathematics, then I found, because I was so interested in what they were talking about, that my recall of the graphs increased no end. And I found that within about perhaps 2 years, I was sufficiently confident to go solo and read on my own, with, of course, with a dictionary. I find it still quite difficult to. I'm not at all quick in modern Chinese. So the modern Chinese commentaries are a bit of a labour, and the Japanese commentaries, which any really serious Chinese scholar would need to master, I have to do that indirectly by going to collaborators. The chief collaborator I have on Chinese studies is Nathan Sivin, with whom I wrote the book called The Way and the Word, who's based in Philadelphia. And we discovered that we had mutual interests in this comparison that were there was rather an interesting difference in his approach from mine, but nevertheless we collaborated. It took an awful long time to finish that book because we were doing other things, but eventually the book came out. It wasn't quite the book that I'd predicted, but it was a book that was made a statement about the differences between Greek and Chinese intellectual life, and particularly the institutional framework and the conceptual framework of that life. Now, so I began to be heavily involved in Chinese studies, and we've gone back to China several times, and I'll be going to China again this July. The person who invited me, who's invited me since, is the head of the Institute for the History of Natural Sciences in Beijing, called Liu Dun, who's a great friend. And again, when I went there as the Zhu Kezhen lecturer, Zhu Kezhen is the primary historian of science in China. Zhukezhen. And I gave a series of lectures, which are actually on Chinese television. Lecturing in English, because I can't cope with lecturing in Chinese. They throw questions at me in modern Chinese, but because I know what I've said and I have a pretty shrewd idea what's bothering them, I can usually follow what they're saying. But he invited me back, and I've found again that the students are amazingly talented and very persistent. They're persistent beyond the point where a Western student would say, well, it's not polite to go on pressing Lloyd as to why he's got these dotty ideas, but the Chinese are not at all inhibited, God bless them. And so ever since, I've been doing half of my time, at least, is involved in Chinese studies. I've been doing these comparative studies, although it's not just comparative studies, because I continue to write books on Aristotle and Greek medicine. But that moment in 1987, when I decided that I really must study it in the original, was one other big turning point. I don't know how many turning points I've got, but that's the most recent one. I'd known Joseph Needham ever since the political period in Cambridge. That's to say the 69, 70, 71. At that stage, Joseph was master of keys, and I used to consult him, and I used to try to line him up to represent a moderate and indeed liberal point of view in university politics. He didn't like being involved in university politics, and he would often say that his primary obligation was to complete Science and Civilization in China, and I could take the force of that argument. But I got to know him quite a bit. When I was a quite young lecturer, I don't know which year it would have been, but the person he used to consult on Greek material was Arthur Peck. Arthur Peck was on sabbatical, I think, at Princeton. And so, and Joseph said to Arthur, well, who shall I consult? And Arthur Peck said, well, try Lloyd. And so I got one of these little cards with the question, when was the first Greek diving bell? Answer on this card and send it back to me. There was a very little space. Actually, it's a fairly straightforward question. And there is a determinate, well, the first one we know about at least. So I'd known Joseph in that context, but by the time I got back here and was studying Chinese more seriously, I then got involved. I was made one of the trustees of his trust. It was going through a very, very rough passage. The Needham Research Institute is an independent body which has its board of trustees, but it's had its ups and its downs. And I became a trustee at the moment when there were problems about finance, there were problems that there hadn't been a volume of SCC, Science and Civilization in China, for many years, and the thing appeared to be rather moribund, and people were predicting that it would have to close and would close.
What date was this?
We're talking about 1989, 1990. And by then I'd become Master of Darwin. But I was keen to do my bit to help Joseph because it's a marvellous library which I'd begun to use, and I thought that his work was very important. So I was happy to be a trustee. Then I suppose it must have been either 91 or maybe 92, when they needed a new chairman of the trustees. And Joseph, the chairman of the trustees, the original chairman, had been Eric Roll, who was a great city figure, head of an PLC, forget which PLC it was, but a very important figure. And so Joseph wanted somebody who would represent the NRI, Needham Research Institute, in the city. But he couldn't find one, and then he tried various people in Cambridge until he finally got to me. I was about his 6th or 7th choice, I believe. And I said, yes, well, I'm perfectly prepared to take on the business of being a chairman. But I laid down as a condition that I would have a program of reform of the Institute. We had to have proper accounts, where there were no proper accounts. We had to have proper publication board and so on and so on. And I said, well, I'll do my best, and we've got to find the funding for this, but give me a year, and I'll see how I get on. But if at the end of the year either the rest of the trustees don't want to continue with this, or that I've not succeeded, then I said that I would resign. But this concentrated the mind, rather, of the rest of them, and I turned the thing round. I mean, that's an arrogant way of putting it, but actually it was pretty moribund, and death was imminent. And by the time I'd had a couple of years and got support both from the Hong Kong Sister Trust and from the New York Sister Trust, things were looking better. Of course, there's still a problem of finding sufficient finance, but it's now a flourishing organization. There are plenty of young scholars who come by, and that's where I have my office. So I'm very grateful to them for tolerating me, despite the fact that I'm now no longer chairman. I've been succeeded in the chair by Lady Pamela Yude, who's a very remarkable individual with masses of Chinese experience. She's the widow of a governor of Hong Kong. But
Spell her name?
Youde.
Right.
But I'm happy to be there, and it gives me plenty of contact with young, very bright Chinese scholars. People sometimes say, well, the Chinese are not particularly up to date in various areas. Well, they're not that up to date in some areas, but on the whole, most of the ones that are working in the history of ideas are pretty bright, and they get up to date in no time at all. Do you want me to say a bit about Darwin?
Yes. Master of Darwin.
Yes. Well, I went there in 1989, and it's a very different college from King's. No money, so no quarrels about how to spend the money, because you don't have the money to spend. There were quite a lot of earmarked funds for things like research fellowships, so they did pretty well, and we managed to increase the number of research fellowships on the basis of the grants that we've been given. There's a Finley Fellowship, for example, and there are 2 Finley Fellowships now. And the research fellowship program is really quite lively. It's a graduate college. It was co-residential even before King's was. It was founded in 1964. And the graduate students are quite mature. They come from all over the world. There's about 60 or 70 different nationalities represented in the college. And they are usually pretty motivated, pretty highly motivated people. Not necessarily the one-year students, but the PhD students certainly are. I got on fine with the graduate students, and we woke up 11 years later to discover that I was about to retire, and it had gone like in a flash. And I really enjoyed it because the atmosphere within the college was very friendly. There's the Darwin lecture series, which is quite challenging, interdisciplinary, on such themes as space or colour or evolution. And I used to have to look after I didn't plan the program, but I had to look after the speakers when they were there. And I got to meet a whole lot of very interesting people in that context. And it was quite a successful operation. It plays to packed Lady Mitchell Hall. Usually the little hall, there's closed circuit television, that's often full too. So it has a dedicated audience within Cambridge, partly university, partly actually town. And I enjoyed that, although it was sometimes a bit difficult to cope with the unpredictable. People would come and give lectures, and although I could introduce them on the basis of what they'd already done, what they then did in their lecture was something that I had to stay awake in order to sum up at the end, but that was quite a challenge, and I found that I developed a certain knack for just the 3 sentences at the end kind of thing that didn't sum up but gave people a sense of not having wasted their time. So we really enjoyed Darwin, and I go back to Darwin perhaps even a little bit more than I come to King's. But I, of course, am not known to the graduate students in the way that I used to be, nor do I know them. There are lots of good friends there, but I rather miss it. I rather miss that involvement, although in a way I'm quite relieved not to be involved any longer. It was a period which I found not at all difficult for me and for Xi. Xi threw herself into it. She enjoyed it too, and we had fun. And then, as I say, we woke up one fine morning to discover that we had to be replaced.
Well, there were just 1 or 2 final questions I wanted to ask.
Certainly.
There were 3 people. I just wondered if you could comment on what. One is Eric Hobsbawm.
Yes.
You talk about
yes.
in our interview.
Yes.
You knew him quite well. Yes.
Well, Eric, I met Eric very early on when I was an undergraduate, and he was marvellous. He took me back to his rooms and a whole lot of other people having coffee, and I had no idea, 1, that he was a Don, 2, that he was, such an interesting and important person. But Eric was always a person who would have a particular point of view, either on political matters or on literary matters. He was a research fellow here. He got a job in London, but I said that my own contemporaries weren't terribly political, and that's correct. The main subjects of interest were philosophy and literature and so on. But Eric would always give you a particular view from a political perspective, and at the same time he's a polymath and can talk about just about everything. I've read his autobiography with great interest, particularly the description of his life in Berlin, which was obviously a turning point for him. But he was a marvellous person to interact with in Cambridge.
Second person of that sort of generation who actually interviewed Jack Goody was Jack. Do you know Jack at all well?
Jack Goody?
Yeah.
Yes, not so very well. I've got to know Jack better, more thoroughly over the years, and I still see him quite a bit. But the King's anthropology was sometimes rather in opposition, thought of as being rather different from the kind of anthropology that Jack did. And am I right in saying that Edmund would have preferred Tambaya to have been his successor rather than Jack? I don't know whether that's true or not, but Edmund used to have quite a few critical remarks to make about everybody.
Well, you would have preferred Tamby to be Myers' successor, yes. Did you say that? Because Edmund was never professor. I mean, he was an ad hominem professor. He was never...
Right, to be Myers' successor, yes.
I think he would, yes. Probably.
Yes. But I gave seminars, various... at the moment when Jack was writing The Domestication of the Savage Mind, and I'd been doing Magic, Reason and Experience, I gave seminars. I can remember one where Esther Goody was leaping to the defense of Jack because I was suggesting that this focus on alphabetic writing was overdone, and I was suggesting that really the more important aspects that we should take into consideration were political and institutional, which is the Vernon line or the Vidal-Naquet line. It was rather paradoxical because here's me, an ancient historian, arguing a sociological argument, and Jack, a social anthropologist, arguing a philological point of view. But I gave seminars, so we interacted, and we got on okay. And he certainly was a very careful reader of Magic, Reason and Experience, and also the book that I wrote called Demystifying Mentalities. And we've disagreed, but we've disagreed in a very amicable way, and I always got a great deal out of talking with him.
The last person was G. You mentioned.
Yes.
Just say something more about her. Is
Yes.
there any more you'd like to say? And do you have children?
Yes, we have 3 sons. One's in New Zealand, one's in London, one is half in London and half in Barcelona. I think when I was tutor, and life was fairly hectic, I think that G, bringing up those 3 boys, I gave her much less help than I should have done. And she had a pretty tough time being tutor's wife and being involved in undergraduate. She had 1 or 2 nasty experiences with undergraduates who were besotted with her, though I don't blame the undergraduates for being. But she was bringing up children, and so I was less supportive than I should have been. I'm a pretty old-fashioned kind of, I never changed a nappy. I mean, I have to confess that, I come from a generation where you could get away with that, whereas my sons are absolutely marvellous fathers to their children. Interesting children they are too. But G was introduced to, started off as a translator because Moses Finley gave her some work. She's translated 60 or 70 books. She's won the top prize for a translation twice, the Scott Moncrieff Prize in England. A couple of years ago, the top translation published in America. She's extremely successful, and of course, she reacts very differently to different kinds of work. She translated Descolas Les Lances du Crépuscule, which I think that won a prize, and she really enjoyed that, including doing the poetry into sort of doggerel, and that was a real challenge. She's done some important. She's translated Vernon, Vidal-Naquet, and Détienne. Her translation of Les Jardins d'Adonis, The Gardens of Adonis, was given a rave review by Edmund Leach. This is a book that I suppose had been translated. I haven't got that date, but it's sometime, I suppose, in the late 60s. And Edmund reviewed it twice, actually. He reviewed it anonymously in the TLS, and then publicly in the JRAI, I suppose. And this is a bit naughty, really, because he was cited twice over on the back of the book, as if he were two different people. But and the translation was structuralism. That's what it was. It was Détienne applying Lévi-Straussian structuralism to the myth about Adonis. And Edmund thought that this was very interesting, because Edmund himself had these interesting classical Greek antiquity. Time and False Noses has a marvellous discussion of time in Greece. And Edmund thought the world of that. And so she is a very well-respected translator, and she likes translating. It's extremely lucky that she is able to take her work wherever we go. We've made it really a policy that we always travel together to China, Japan, wherever it might be, and sometimes that's she's doing me a favour by coming along, because she knows that I really need, at the end of a hard day's conference, I need a bit of a giggle.
Well, that takes me to just two last sort of questions about your work methods and so on. First is, you are extraordinary, to me anyway, in the way in which, when I first met you, you were senior tutor,
Yep.
and how you managed throughout your life both to be an extremely good administrator and a creative runner of institutions, and to produce so much high-level academic work. Many people find they can only do one or the other. Are there any tips you can give?
Well, no, I think it's a matter of temperament. I found that I couldn't be involved in research, particularly writing, more than a certain number of hours in a day. So, and administration is a great relaxation. That's a pretty extravagant thing to say, but I did find that combining some completely different kind of activity was a help, well, not a hindrance. And I used to make it a rule that I would work at home. Both she and I are pretty insomniac, so there are not very many hours that we actually sleep. And so I'm working away and writing away, and then I used to come in at about 11 o'clock, something like that, when I was tutor. Again, in Darwin...
What time did you start working then?
Well, it would depend upon, partly a question of winter or summer, but in the summer it would be 6:30, something like that. And then on the working in front of the table. But Darwin was very good, because it allowed me to take a lot of time off in Spain. We have a little refuge in Spain, fully equipped with dictionaries and the main texts, both Greek and Chinese. And they allowed me to go off there. And again, we could both sort of concentrate on work there. And that's where I've done lots of my writing. So it's a routine. The relaxation is picking almonds or making olive oil by hand, which is what we do in the winter, or looking after or chasing away the wild goats. I won't go on about Spain, it would take me too long.
It's obviously important. This is a rather pompous question, but if someone asked you whether you have any particular philosophy of history or advice on to people who work on the intersection between history and anthropology, is there anything you'd like to say about that?
Often theories, if you try to apply theories, are not very helpful. I think it's a question of responding to what you have in front of you. That's a very sort of British empirical kind of remark, and of course you can't respond without having a theoretical framework, that's for sure. But immersing yourself, what I imagine about anthropology, if I'd been an anthropologist, field work would have been very much in the tradition of the field work from Malinowski onwards. Immersing yourself and letting the questions emerge slowly after one's got a feel for the society that you've been studying. I don't know whether that corresponds to anything very much, but that is sometimes the impression that some monographs give is that there was a foregone conclusion that you must be talking about newer religion, for example. But talking to some anthropologists, I think that what the problem is that they should focus on only becomes clear after a time. Now that's very much the case, I think, with studying ancient societies. One's got to have one's got to immerse oneself in everything that there is that you can lay your hands on. Of course, that's more difficult for me with China because I've only been doing it since 1987 than it is with Greece. But I feel I ought to know where to look, both in the primary text, primary evidence, and in the secondary literature. But the idea of any golden rule, I think we've probably had too many golden rules, and what we need a bit more of is field work.
So, is there anything that I haven't covered that you would like to just say as a last kind of
fling?
There's no need to, but sometimes a message to 100 years' time. It
would be interesting. I wish 100 years could communicate with me. No, I find that I've been very fortunate in the sense that I've met marvellous people, and at particular turning points in my life, things have worked out much better than I dared hope. And I suppose one thing that we haven't mentioned in so many words is that both here in King's and in Darwin, there's a hell of a lot to be said for the kind of mix that you get in these colleges. There's a hell of a lot to be said for the possibility of interaction that presents. I have taught for considerable periods. That's to say, I was a visiting professor at Cornell. It meant I had to stay there 3 months or 6 months on several different occasions over 6 years. But the universities that don't have a collegiate framework, the departments are very, very inward-looking. They're very narrow, and they don't have the chance to meet people like Edmund Leach in the chapel. I mean, they don't have the crazy rituals that we have, but on the other hand, they're very inward-looking. And when I gave the Seder lectures in Berkeley in 1984, a number of people came from different departments, including a chap called MacDonnell and Heilbronn, who's a very famous historian of science, various philosophers and so on. And we got to know them, and we gave a goodbye party at the end of the lectures. We'd had lots of parties thrown for us, which were very generous. But we all our friends that I'd got to talk to about what I'd been talking about came, and quite a few of them didn't know one another. So, we were delighted, as it were, to know them all, but it was rather a lack. and compared with which, being able to talk to anthropologists, philosophers, and classicists, and scientists, because I collaborated with scientists. Gabriel Horn, Hal Dixon have helped me in their day, long time ago now. So it's a great advantage, and I think I owe quite a bit to this institution, King's, but also to the institutions of Oxbridge.
That's a very nice point to end on. Thank you very much indeed, Geoffrey.